So what if you don't have static data but dynamic data, as it's the case here, where the data we fetch depends on a route parameter? Well, the Angular router also helps you with that, though not with help of the data property. Instead, you can add another property to your route configuration, and that would be the resolve property. And resolve now works a bit like data, but for dynamic instead of static data. Because resolve wants an object here where you can have key value pairs where the keys are totally up to you. But the values then are not static data like they are in this data object, but instead the values now must be valid Angular resolvers, which in modern Angular are simply functions. In older versions of Angular, you would use classes instead, and the next lecture will take care about that. Here, we'll focus on the more modern style. Therefore, for example here, we could go to this user tasks component file here and add such a resolver function there, though you could add it in any file you want. It doesn't have to be done there. Therefore, what we could do is we could go to this user tasks component TypeScript file, and then there, outside of that class, we could export a function that could be named resolve user name, though the name is up to you. I'm naming it like this because I plan on using it as a resolver function for this component, for this route here, and because I plan to fetch the username because that's also what we're doing here in ng-on-init at the moment. So therefore here we can define this function, and this function should then be a function that is accepted by Angular in that resolve array. Now to be accepted there, it must have a certain signature. And to ensure this signature, I'll actually convert it to a function that's created slightly different by actually creating a constant or variable named resolve username, in which I then store a function like this. You can do that in JavaScript and TypeScript, but this notation now allows me to assign a type to that constant, which then allows me to ensure that I set up the correct function signature. Because the type of this function should be resolve fn for resolve function, and that is a type that is imported from @AngularRouter. Now with that imported and assigned here, we have to set up this function such that it adheres to this type definition. And it does adhere to that if it accepts two parameters, where the first one is the activated route, which is of type activated route snapshot. So that's of course similar to the activated route we injected earlier in this section, but now it's just that snapshot, which I already mentioned. So that snapshot where you can't subscribe to parameters and so on, because this resolver will be called for every navigation action. So every time this route gets active, this resolver function will be called, and it will then receive the latest snapshot that describes this activated route. That's why there is no reason to subscribe to it here, because it will be re-executed. This function will be re-executed whenever the route becomes active, even if it already was active. So it will be called again if the route parameter changes, for example. The second parameter that should be accepted here is the current router state, which is of type router state snapshot. So that's another type which, just like activated route snapshot, must be imported from Angular router. Now in this resolver function, we then also need to return something. We need to return the data that should be resolved by that function. And that of course should be the username, which should be fetched basically as we're doing it here, with help of the user's service. But this service is injected into this class here This resolver function here, however, is outside of this class. It's not a class method, and therefore it doesn't have access to that service. But thankfully, Angular allows you to inject things like services into these resolver functions as well, with help of this inject function. Not with help of the constructor, because functions don't have constructors, but we can call the inject function here in that resolver function and inject the user's service. Angular will make sure that this works. So that gives us access to that user's service in this resolver function as well. And with that injected, we can then get hold of that user name by basically executing the same code we have up here, without the this keyword, since we're not in a class now. But now we can call users service users find, but we also need to get access to the route parameters. But we thankfully do get access to that with help of that activated route snapshot here. So we can use our activated route here, because that has a param map property which has that get method. So that's how we can get hold of that. And as I mentioned before, this resolver function will be re-executed every time the route parameter changes. So therefore, we don't have to set up a subscription or anything like that here. Instead, it will be re-executed automatically by Angular whenever we load a different user. And with that, we therefore then got the username, and we can return that here in that resolver function. Now, TypeScript is still complaining here because actually it wants some extra information on that resolve fn type regarding the return value of this function. So you should add angle brackets here and then define the shape of the data you're returning here. And in my case, it's a simple string. So between these angle brackets, in this case here, you should simply put string. And that's then the finished resolver function. The question now just is how you make that data that's fetched by this function available to this component class here and to the overall component therefore. And the answer is essentially just as it was the case here with that static data. If you have this component input binding enabled, your resolved data will be made available to that target component as an input property. So therefore, what we should do is go to our route definition, and then here in this resolve object, you can pick any key name of your choice, like username. As a value, you now should point at this resolver function, so not at some static data. Therefore, the value here is resolve username, and this now should not be executed. You don't have parentheses here. Instead, you just point at this function because Angular will execute it for you. And the value returned by that resolver function will then be made available to this component through an input with this name. So in my case, with the name username. Therefore, what we can and should do as a next and final step is go back to that user tasks component. And there we can get rid of ng-on-init because that entire data fetching now no longer has to be performed in here. Instead, we can now simply accept an input. And we can get rid of all this code here as well, therefore, also of this, and just change our username here, this property, to be an input, for example, by using the input function or by using the input decorator. That, of course, would also work. And it can be a required input here, and I know that I'll get a value of type string. So that's how we could set this up. And this implements on-init thing here also should go, and we can and should then also remove these unused imports. Like that. And with that, we got a much leaner component now. It barely contains any code, as you can tell. Instead, that's now all in that resolver function, and that function could theoretically also be stored in some other file. And therefore, we outsourced that data fetching task from the component to the resolver, which can be an elegant way of getting your component data when using routing. Now, since I'm using the input function here, username will be a signal, and therefore we should call it as such in our template to get that signal value. But with that done, if you save everything, you should be able to go back and still see that username here, and you see it changes as you switch between users, but now it's loaded with help of that resolver. And that's of course not a feature you have to use, because as you saw, it worked without that as well, but it is a feature you can use to have leaner components. That's in the end the main advantage. And you could of course also have multiple resolvers here if you had multiple key value pairs. That would all work. So now we learned about static and dynamic data that can be provided to routes and their components. Now, you can get access to both the static and the dynamic data either through inputs, if you have the appropriate configuration, or also in another way, which I also want to show you here, since you of course should know about it. And for that, I'll bring back on init here to demonstrate you that other way and re-add ng on init, because that other way relies on the injected activated route, just as we did it before for the route parameter. So here I'll inject the activated route again into this user tasks component, because it's now this activated route that does not just have this param map property which we used before, but that also has a data property. And that data property holds the merged static and dynamically resolved data. Or to be precise, it provides an observable that in the end gives you that merged data, and that will re-emit a value whenever that route changes and the data therefore changes. So you could subscribe here and set up that next function where you get that data. And then if I log that data here, you will see that what we log here will be an object that contains both that message and the username, which will change every time we change the user. Of course, we should also clean up that subscription here, but to keep things simple here and just focus on this feature, I'll leave it like this for now. And if you then save everything, you'll see that I got this object being logged here initially, and it contains the static data, the message, and the dynamically resolved username. And if I switch to a different user, I got a new object that contains the updated data, the static one and the dynamically resolved one. And here I will not use this approach. I'll comment this out because I will instead use this input here since it's leaner and simpler. But of course, you should also know about this approach because you might encounter it in other projects, and it simply is an alternative way of getting hold of that data.